Uh, it's been a hot minute since I've done a presentation, so please bear with me if I make any mistakes or kind of fumble on words and whatnot. Uh, I started doing stereo back around 2016, trying to do making a camera rig using 2 smartphones, but I don't have any of the images from that, sadly. But more recently, I got a camera lot from eBay. Uh, It was 17 broken Nikon D3400s from Kuwait, and they were like submerged in mud and kind of destroyed to some degree, but their circuitry was pretty uh, mostly okay. There was a bit of corrosion, which you can kind of see here. Um, Forgive my mouse cursor. I need to, one sec. Yeah. So yeah, there's some corrosion you can see in the upper right-hand corner that I ended up repairing to some degree. Um, I went through and I disassembled them and I reassembled them. Uh, Used an ultrasonic cleaner to remove any debris, and then I went through and I fixed components and whatnot. This isn't really about the repair themselves, so I'm not going to get too deep into that. But there's a UV and IR filter that is in front of each of these sensors. Initially, I had planned to use these for astrophotography. So the intention was to remove all the filters in front of the sensor and remove the Bayer uh, filters themselves from the sensors using like a fiber laser, because it increases their efficiency. Functionally, it would probably be better to just buy a monochrome sensor, but I had a bunch of these cameras from the lot, so might as well use it. Um, there was also a plan to use a thermoelectric cooler to increase the signal to noise ratio for each of the sensors, but I have yet to implement that. An issue I found is that the cameras aren't really designed to uh, be completely remotely operated, and a lot of the function of the camera is disabled in the software. So I'd have to go through and reverse engineer that, and it's technically possible, but it just adds extra time that I don't think I really should spend on that. I ended up getting a number of ETX90 uh, telescopes, and the intention was to make a camera or a telescope array using this, because you can increase the signal to noise ratio by stacking the frames from multiple telescopes. Um, yep. Uh, I didn't mention this before, but the cross-eyed view is on the top, and the uh, parallel view is on the bottom, which is kind of reverse to the norm here.
Goopy
But
Ben.
so the aperture of this is about 90 millimeters, which isn't that great, and the f ratio is about, like, I think 13 or something like that. So I ended up wanting to get more light collection capability, and then switched over to a 6-inch, and then another 6-inch, and then I ended up upgrading to two 10-inch telescopes. Um, I need to make a saddle that can support both of them still, but uh, it's in progress. I ended up getting a tracking mount here, which enables me to point these telescopes more accurately than I was able to before. Initially, I had a clock drive mount, and the tracking precision with a clock drive mount is significantly inferior to one that is computer controlled. That you can do auto guiding with the computer controlled mounts, whereas you can't with the clock drive mounts. The initial intent was to set up two tracking mounts about a few, like 10 kilometers apart, so I can track the ISS as it goes overhead and get stereo information on it. So that's still in progress. I need to get a second tracking mount and then sync their movement. This is an image. It was kind of frosty out, and you could see dew accumulating on the telescope. These are some of my photos I've accumulated. I'm not very good at processing the images, so while the data is there, I don't really. I'm not at the point where I think the color contrast is not that great, and there's a lot of noise. I probably should get a field flattener as well. There's a lot of like comma, which you can kind of see here. In this image, down in the lower left, there was a hypernova happening that I didn't really realize until months afterwards. I went back and I looked at my data, and that little dot right there is a little supernova hypernova thing. Around this time, I realized I had two cameras and I could make a Hyperstereo rig, so I got uh, like a 19-inch rack rail, and I just bolted them to it. Um, it rains a lot here in Washington, so I had a moment of panic when it started to rain, and I didn't want to stop the time lapse, so I ended up throwing a garbage bag over it. Completely unrelated. I don't know why I included this, but I also started making bread. That was fun. Uh, anyway, the camera layout is as such. This is the rail, USB hub. I have it such the center of gravity is just above the ball mount, so it's a lot more stable that way. Otherwise, it might like flip around. I also have a phone mount so that I can do a reference image because the UV and IR filters are removed. It's considered a full spectrum camera, which has some issues with white balance. So having the phone reference is incredibly useful for post-processing. This is the parts list. This is in USD. The cameras ended up being about $29 per camera. I only spent like, I don't know, a few hours on average per camera. So that was pretty efficient in terms of the cost per camera. Yeah. So from here on out, there'll be a lot more stereos if you want to align yourself for that. This is the first time I'd gone out with the stereo cameras outside of my backyard doing basically test shots. This is a view from the cameras. I live on an island by a ferry, and it's a pretty nice little target. Those are the Olympics in the background. There's a bit of a desync here. The camera acquisition software that I use, Entangle, ends up having an odd non-uniform capture, so it ends up like offsetting it by a few seconds frequently. But in this particular case, it's nice because you can see the clouds in stereo based on their movement. Another shot of the camera rig. Here, I think I can set it to be autoplay. Yeah, so from here on out, it's just basically a slideshow for the images. If you guys have any questions, now would be the time to ask them. At the end, there's going to be a time lapse that I compiled.
Well, one question about your hyperbar. Virtually every time I've seen a rig like that, the cameras are on top. And I was wondering what your technical reason is for having them hanging upside down.
Oh, it's just more stable that way. It's kind of like one of those little bird toys that have the wings that are weighted.
Mm-hmm. Just
Having
balances better.
Yeah, it adds a little bit more complexity because I have to flip all the images in post. Technically, I think the cameras have gyros in them, so it can sense the rotation. But I'm not currently using that EXIF data. This is I was out hunting for bioluminescence, and there were some kayakers who were also doing that. And I was trying to do a time lapse of them. You can kind of see them off in the distance there, those little green glow sticks that they had set up. But there was some really cool like light interference. I don't really know. Like there's a differential here with the lenses that I thought was kind of neat. Yeah, but the purple haze is because it's picking up UV and IR, and it's not white balancing properly. But it's kind of neat, I think. You can see a lot of like near infrared cameras and whatnot that people have set up. It's kind of annoying at times because if you're trying to do like astrophotography, it'll flood the scene quite frequently. I noticed there were some animal calls from over here, so I walked over and there was what, a heron, I think. He walked over and started fishing. I looked down and you could see, it's kind of hard to see in these images, but there are little teeny fish in the water, and I'm thinking I want to go back and try to do another illuminated version of this where I get like a floodlight or something and pointing it in the water and then do a time lapse of it. You can see crabs moving around and starfish. I have many more frames for most of these images as a time lapse, but yeah, it's hard. I need to compile them still. There were some seals, which is pretty neat. I heard a bunch of like their calls, and I didn't really realize what it was until I walked over. There was a seal sitting on this pipe here, and then there's also a bird. It's kind of hard to see because the waves are moving it up and down, and I kind of thought the particulates in the water is interesting. You can kind of see the depth, which is quite nice. Another thing I'm quite fond of is seeing reflections for hyperstereo stuff. This is another area. I was out looking for auroras, but in this particular instance, I did not notice this aurora. So I've only got a few frames of the aurora before I turn away. It's kind of hard to see, but there's a heron. It's like that little dot along the coast there. With the Milky Way backdrop. Completely different area. I went down to NASA Ames and I took some photos, and I realized that the photos I took were kind of lined up to potentially be a stereo photo. So I combined them. This is Hangar 1. It's, I believe, one of the largest airship hangars in existence. And then this is, I think, the NASA U2, which is like a spy plane, basically, but that has been converted over to NASA research stuff. Around this time, I got a sputterer, a thing for coating things in metal. It's a magnetron a DC magnetron sputterer, which and lets me coat like gold and other materials onto substrates that would be kind of hard to coat otherwise. This was kind of neat. I 3D printed a structure here and just threw it in the sputterer, and I thought it was kind of neat. I was thinking of using it for RF purposes, making like enclosures and whatnot. This is from a game, Majora's Mask. I printed this for my sibling. These are some helmets, or this is one helmet at different points in the process. that my little sister wanted for a cosplay she's doing. Bread. Around this time, I also picked up baking, so I made some bread. Food. I picked up some mass spectrometers for ludicrously cheap, and this is from one of those mass spectrometers. It's a turbomolecular pump. It's for making pretty high-end vacuum. These are more turbomolecular pumps. Thought it was kind of neat, so I included it. This one might not mesh very well, but it's just a tree. Thought it was neat. This is as a passenger in a car. Every once in a while, I take photos and delay it by a few seconds just so I can get the stereo effect. I quite like the middle cloud layer there. You can kind of see the depth more than you would otherwise. I think the baseline is like, I don't know, 100 meters or something like that. This is a beach I frequent. It has a nice tree, a lot of like grass that you can kind of see. A lot of ships going through, which is kind of neat. Doggo. There was I believe there was an aurora that night, but I couldn't quite see it because of the cloud cover. The clouds were quite illuminated though. I need to make a time lapse of this. This is I put the stereo rig in the back of my car and was driving around trying to get some interesting hyperlapse footage, but I haven't compiled it yet. I thought this was kind of neat. It's just some random trees that I drove by. There was it's kind of hard to see in this, but there was a meteor that you can kind of see in the upper right hand corner here. This is when I was out hunting for auroras. It's kind of weird how frequent you meet really cool people while out hunting for auroras. There was this guy who works at Helion that I met. He is a fusion engineer, technically a pulse power engineer, but he works at a fusion company, I meant to say. At some point, I accidentally breathed on the lenses, so there's a significant amount of blurriness, but it ended up clearing up. This is another time where I was hunting for, there was a comet going overhead. The Atlas, I can't pronounce it. It's the A3 comet. But you can't really see it here, but it's right here, just behind the cloud cover. I have a time lapse of it that I have compiled. Let me see if I can play that here for you. If you look just above the bench, you should see it at the very end of this. That little faint little smudge on the horizon. Probably should have used a more zoomed in lens for this, but one moment. So this is a time lapse of the aurora. It was a lot fainter in person. I think a large component of the light emissions from it were UV, so that's why that camera has picked it up a bit more. Sadly, a lot of headlights have very bright emissions in the UV and IR, so that's why there's a lot of flashing in the foreground. But yeah, that's about it. I have a bit on workflow after this if I can get into, but if you guys have any questions, you can